I don't know if this is the last Samhain, the last Halloween of the world we once knew. If, in crossing it, we will enter a darkness from which generations may not recover. The first cracks in our world started to appear at the beginning of the year, and it's remarkable how quickly it has progressed. The plague has touched everything. People have lost their minds. Fires are raging, and citizens are at each other's throats. Outside my door, on the lightless street, under the smoke-clouded sky, garbage is piled high. People are leaving human waste on the sidewalks. A few days ago, I started feeling a rumbling under the pavement, a labored heaving under the foundations of my home. The sinkhole in the other neighborhood is not what it appears. As the invisible sickness has bound people to their homes and sundered relations and exploded economies, the graboids, like fetal objects, like cast-off placenta, have begun resurfacing, their many heads rupturing the suburban green. I don't know how long I'll escape the microscopic monsters that have been stalking our blood. I don't know how long I'll resist the chthonic maws of the underworld chewing towards my floor. But as another Samhain dawns, this time truly at the edge of a shuddering and vulnerable civilization, I wanted to turn to a tribute written by one master of the unthinkable to another. Jorge Luis Borges, his story, There Are More Things, which he penned in memory of H.P. Lovecraft. The story starts at my alma mater, the University of Texas at Austin, where the protagonist learns of the death of his uncle in a remote part of South America. He recalls spending time with his uncle, learning philosophy at a property called the Red House, which eventually his uncle had to sell due to financial difficulties. The house had been purchased by a mysterious man who promptly cast all the home's furnishings into a dump and then tried to hire someone to refashion the house in monstrous ways. Now that his uncle has passed away, the young man is curious about the fate of the house, curious and disturbed. Where I want to pick up the story is after he has traveled to South America and talked to folks about his uncle's demise and the condition of the strange red house. One man tells the protagonist about the bizarre construction requests, which he refused, and a puzzling and disturbing encounter near the house on a dark night where his horse was spooked and he saw something he couldn't bring himself to name. That night I couldn't sleep, the protagonist tells us. Toward sunrise, I dreamed of an engraving in the style of Pineresi, one I'd never seen before, or perhaps had seen and forgotten, an engraving of a kind of labyrinth. It was a stone amphitheater with a border of cypresses, but its walls stood taller than the tops of trees. There were no doors or windows, but it was pierced by an infinite series of narrow vertical slits. I was using a magnifying glass to try to find the Minotaur. At last I saw it. It was the monster of a monster. It looked less like a bull than like a buffalo, and its human body was lying on the ground. It seemed to be asleep and dreaming. But dreaming of what or of whom? That evening I passed by the Red House. The gate in the fence was locked, and some iron bars had been twisted around it. What had been the garden was now weeds. Off to the right there was a shallow ditch, and its banks were trampled. I had one card still up my sleeve, but I put off playing it for several days, not only because I sensed how utterly useless it would be, but also because it would drag me into the inevitable, the ultimate. Finally, with no great hopes, I went to glue. Mariani, the carpenter, now getting on in years, was a fat, rosy Italian, a very friendly, unpretentious fellow. The minute I saw him, I discarded the stratagems that had seemed so promising the day before. I gave him my card, which he spelled out to himself aloud with some ceremony and with a slight reverential hitch when he came to the PhD. I told him I was interested in the furnishings he had made for the house that had belonged to my uncle in Tudela. The man talked on and on. I will not attempt to transcribe his many and expressively gesticulated words, but he assured me that his motto was, "Meet the client's demands no matter how outrageous," and told me he'd lived up to it. After rummaging around in several boxes, he showed me some papers I couldn't read, signed by the Alupius Praetorius. No doubt he took me for a lawyer. When we were saying our goodbyes, he confided that all the money in the world couldn't persuade him to set foot again in Tudela, much less in that house. He added that the customer is always right, but that, in his humble opinion, Sir Praetorius was not quite right, if I knew what he meant. He tapped his forehead with his finger. Then, regretting he'd gone so far, he would say no more. I could not get another word out of him. I had foreseen this failure, but it is one thing to foresee something, and another thing when it comes to pass. Over and over I told myself that time, that infinite web of yesterday, today, the future, forever and ever, is the only one enigma. Such profound thoughts availed me nothing. After dedicating my evening to the study of Schopenhauer or Royce, I would still wander, night after night, along the dirt roads bordering the red house. At times I would make out a very white light up on the hill. At others, I would think I could hear moaning. This went on until the 19th of January. It was one of those days in Buenos Aires when one feels not only insulted and abused by the summer, but actually degraded. It was about 11 that night when the storm clouds burst. First came the south wind, and then the sheets, waves, torrents of water. I scurried about in the darkness, trying to find a tree to take shelter under. In the sudden sharp light from a bolt of lightning, I found that I was but steps from the fence. I am not certain whether it was with fear or hopefulness that I tried the gate. Unexpectedly, it opened. Buffeted by the storm, I made my way in. Sky and earth alike compelled me. The front door of the house was also ajar. A gust of rain lashed my face, and I went in. Inside, the floor tiles had been taken up. My feet trod grass in clumps and patches. A sweetish, nauseating odor filled the house. To the left or right, I'm not sure which, I stumbled onto a stone ramp. I scrambled up it. Almost unthinkingly, my hand sought the light switch. The dining room and library of my recollections were now, the dividing wall having been torn out, one large ruinous room, with pieces of furniture scattered here and there. I will not attempt to describe them, because in spite of the pitiless white light, I am not certain I actually saw them. Let me explain. In order to truly see a thing, one must first understand it. An armchair implies the human body, its joints and members. Scissors, the act of cutting. What can be told from a lamp or an automobile? The savage cannot really perceive the missionary's Bible. The passenger does not see the same ship's rigging as the crew. If we truly saw the universe, perhaps we would understand it. None of the insensate forms I saw that night corresponded to the human figure or any conceivable use. They inspired horror and revulsion. In one corner, I discovered a vertical ladder that rose to the floor above. The wide iron rungs, no more than 10 in all, were spaced irregularly. That ladder, which implied hands and feet, was comprehensible, and somehow it relieved me. I turned off the light and waited for a while in the darkness. I could hear not the slightest sound, but the presence of so many incomprehensible things unnerved me. At last I made my decision. Upstairs, my trembling hand once again reaching out for the light switch. The nightmare prefigured by the downstairs rooms stirred and flowered in the upper story. There were many objects, or several interwoven ones. I now recall a long, U-shaped piece of furniture like an operating table, very high, with circular openings at the extremes. It occurred to me that this might be the bed used by the resident of the house, whose monstrous anatomy was revealed obliquely by this object, in much the way the anatomy of an animal or a god may be known by the shadow it casts. From some page of Lacan, read years ago and then forgotten, there came to my lips the word amphisbaena, which suggested, though by no means fully captured, what my eyes would later see. I also recall a V of mirrors that faded into shadows above. What must the inhabitant of this house be like? What must it be seeking here on this planet, which must have been no less horrible to it than it to us? From what secret regions of astronomy or time, from what ancient and now incalculable twilight, had it reached this South American suburb and this precise night? I felt that I had intruded, uninvited, into chaos. Outside, the rain had stopped. I looked at my watch and saw with astonishment that it was almost 2 a.m. I left the light on and began consciously to climb back down the ladder. Climbing down what I had once climbed up was not impossible, climbing down before the inhabitant came back. I conjectured that it hadn't locked the front door and the gate because it hadn't known how. My feet were just touching the next to the last rung when I heard something coming up the ramp, something heavy and slow and plural. Curiosity got the better of fear, and I did not close my eyes. Borges feigns a fear of the plural, but the protagonist does not. He locks his eyes, he girds his heart with curiosity. The monstrous is lurching towards us, an unimaginable many one, too many heads for a cool theology or a tidy epistemology. There are different kinds, different stages of nightmares. In the first stage, the horror, the unthinkable other, comes from far away, a distant world, a distant time. In the next, it is clearly part of our world, but still from far off, somewhere at the edges of our maps, or in its forgotten regions. In the next phase, it is something that surfaces quite near us, right in our neighborhood, right in our midst. We find out that the world we live in is not what we thought it was. In the last phase, it is within us. We are split within. We are riven by the unthinkable itself. Who now dares to dance with Cthulhu? Who will linger long with the trouble, as Donna Haraway asks us? Can we look upon that ancient face and not go mad? Or if we do, learn to exercise the sinews of a new way of being on its far side?
Hey everyone, my name is Josh Schlossberg. I write biological horror fiction at a place called Josh's Worst Nightmare, and I have a piece that ties into the whole integral concept that I wrote a little while back, and I'm going to read a little bit from there and then talk about the concepts behind it. So this was a piece called Alpha Syndrome, and here's the little blurb. It's a novel manuscript. Alpha Syndrome. Rufus Schitzblatt is woke as they come, figuratively as a well-meaning, if self-righteous, social justice activist, and literally thanks to the non-stop racket of his downstairs neighbors. And it's sleep deprivation he blames for his disturbing hallucinations of animal parts in place of the anatomy of certain hostile Vermonters. As violence linked to his visions of human-animal mutations hits closer to home, he deduces these aren't delusions at all, but symptoms of a tick-borne illness transforming locals into egocentric alphas, the very type of person he hates most. Overwhelmed, he flees the range of the deer tick to the Rocky Mountains, only to encounter the malady's true source, a curse spread by an ancient entity out to knock humanity down a peg. Stumbling on a cure, Rufus must challenge his rigid ideology by tapping the sweet spot between selfishness and selflessness, evolving his own consciousness to prevent society's nosedive into savagery. So what I'll do right now is I will read the first chapter of Alpha Syndrome. This is not at a bookstore near you and is unlikely to be in one anytime soon, but we'll see. Chapter 1, Alpha Syndrome. Eleanor slammed the screen door in her son Randy's unshaven face and, clutching the railing, hobbled down the porch steps. "Ma, you can't go out there," he groaned. She shuffled along the stone path to the gravel driveway where the Ford was parked and tugged open the driver's side door. Bracing one slipper against the running board, she hoisted herself up into the seat with a grunt, tucked the hem of her robe under a bony thigh, yanked the door shut and locked it. He rushed around the front of the vehicle, his half-unbuttoned Red Sox jersey flapping over his gut, and knocked on the window. The gear shift in neutral, she stuck the key in the ignition and started it. "What do you think you're doing?" he yelled over the roar of the engine. "You know you're not supposed to drive." Technically, he was correct. Thanks to her failing eyes, her doctor had forced her to give up her license years ago. While Lazy Bones hadn't taken kindly to his new role of chauffeur, with enough badgering she could usually pry his rear end off the couch so she could run her errands, especially if his nasty pet scorpion had run out of crickets. But if she intended to catch the trespassers this time, and she sure as Sam hell did, she had no time to fritter away. She disengaged the parking brake, pushed down on the clutch, and slowly released it as she towed the accelerator. The pickup inched forward and she let out the clutch too quickly and the truck stalled. He seized the chance to stand in front of the hood, a palm held out like Diana Ross pantomiming "Stop in the name of love." Annoyed, she laid on the horn, but stubborn as always, he wouldn't budge. She started the engine again, shifted into reverse, and backed up, fully intending to drive over the lawn if he didn't get out of the way. He jogged after her, hopped onto the running board, and hung onto the side view mirror. Shiftless, good-for-nothing though he was, with Hubert gone and her sisters too, he was the only kin she had left, and it wouldn't do to run him over. Mumbling curses, she came to a stop, put the truck in neutral, and cracked the window. "Get down off of there before you hurt yourself," she snapped. He stepped back onto the driveway and held out his hand like a beggar. "Give me the keys." "You gonna drive me up there then?" "Let the police handle it." "You mean like we did the last 2 times they got away? You know I don't condone trespassing on my land, much less popping off rifles. And if you don't got the guts to deal with them, then I will." He shook his head, lips pursed. "All right, you win. I'll drive you." Maybe he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, but having raised him as a good, solid Vermonter meant, with enough browbeating, he usually did the sensible thing. She unlocked the door, shoved over to the passenger side, and fastened her belt as he heaved his bulk into the seat, the suspension squeaking. They puttered down the driveway, crawling across the washed-out section Randy still hadn't filled in 2 weeks after the hurricane. When they reached the paved Agris Gap Road, instead of taking a left up the mountain on the way to the pasture, he turned right towards town. "You're going the wrong damn direction." She swatted his shoulder, but he just accelerated. "You turn around right this second." Jaw set, he hunched over the wheel and shifted into 3rd and then 4th gear, the abandoned schoolhouse, its windows boarded up, the bell tower empty, red paint peeling off like tree bark, passing by in a red blur. "Where are you taking me?" she grumbled. "Dr. Ferguson." "Doctor, what in the blazes for?" "You've been acting strange today, and your face is all lopsided, like you had a stroke or something." They whizzed by the old hayfield. How many summers had she and her sisters raked hay into stacks after Pappy passed through with the tractor? Now it sat patchy and overgrown, water pooling in the low spots, a total waste. "I know what you're up to, and it ain't gonna work this time." "I'm worried about you, Ma." "The only thing you're worried about is getting your grubby mitts on my pills." She flexed her fingers and marveled at the warm tingle, masking her usual arthritic throbbing as if she had taken a few swallows of whiskey. "But the way I've been feeling today, I don't think I'll be refilling the prescription anytime soon." Instead of the reaction she had hoped, he just gazed glumly out the windshield as they swooped downhill past an unpainted sugar shack, cordwood piled outside. As the road flattened, she felt a tickle in her throat. She cleared it and brought up a sticky saliva that tasted like rot. Quickly, she rolled down the window and huffed a loogie outside, the wind whipping a few strands of white hair across her eyes. The intersection of Route 100 was less than a mile away. Once they got on the highway, it was another 9 into Devon and the doctor. By the time that was over and done and they got back to the house, the interlopers would be long gone. Those big city tax crazy regulators who had taken over the State House might have made it impossible to make a living growing cows anymore, but she'd be goddamned if she let strangers wander around the family acreage like it was some grammar school playground. As soon as they got to the stop sign, she figured she'd open the door, jump out, and walk back if she had to. But as she fumbled with the seatbelt, she came up with a better idea. Reaching down, she grabbed the umbrella from the door pocket, and as they rolled up to the stop sign, pointed in front of her son's face and pushed the button. It sprang open like a startled bat, blocking his view of the windshield. "Jesus Christmas!" he yelled and stomped on the brakes, screeching the truck to a halt 100 feet before the intersection, bucking her ribcage against the seatbelt. He tore the umbrella out of her hand, rolled down the window, and tossed it outside. "You trying to get us killed? I'm trying to get you to listen." Her tongue felt funny, like it had grown a bit, which was nonsense, of course. He shook his head at her, a mix of wonder and concern in his eyes, his chest heaving. "I didn't want to believe it, but now I know it's the truth. You got the Alzheimer's and you got it bad." She snorted. "My son, the high school dropout with another of his famous medical diagnoses." Her words came out as if through a mouthful of cotton. Had she forgotten to soak her dentures last night? Nostrils flaring, Randy shifted into gear and pulled up to the stop sign. A stream of tourist traffic rushed by, a newish phenomenon in the historically backwater Thrace River Valley she still hadn't gotten used to. "Let me ask you one question." Annoying as it was, she decided to ignore her newfound speech impediment. "My memory's gone, then how come I remembered to dump all them damn pills down to John before I left the house?" He blinked at her, color rising on his scruffy cheeks. "You didn't." "I don't need him anymore, and we both know you need him less than me." "You're fibbing." "Oh, honey, you ought to know your mother better than that." She ran her tongue across the inside of her dentures and was startled by a scraping sound, like a spoon stirring a mug of tea. Traffic cleared, but rather than veering onto Route 100, he swung a U-turn and barreled back up Agris Gap Road. She poked a finger in her mouth and instead of soft flesh felt something hard, smooth, and sharp at the tip. Calmly, she tugged on it, trying to remove whatever was stuck to her tongue. But as she yanked, she realized it was her tongue. While she knew she should probably be more worried than she was, she found she was only idly curious. Having gone through puberty, pregnancy, cancer, menopause, and rheumatoid arthritis, she learned to take changes to her body in stride. Maybe this was just one no one talked about much. Besides, if it was anything serious, she wouldn't be feeling so damn sprightly. Back at the house now, Randy parked in the driveway, shut off the truck, seized the keys from the ignition, threw open the door, and slid outside. "As soon as I get back, we're heading to the doctor, even if I gotta bungee you down to the bed." He slammed the door and bolted across the driveway, along the path and up the porch stairs to disappear inside. Though her hands hurt less today than they had in almost a decade, she was too thrifty to have wasted a single one of those pricey pills. But by the time he figured that out, it'd be too late. Chuckling, she scooted over the driver's side, flipped down the sun visor, and plucked a spare key. She started the ignition, pushed down the clutch, and towed the accelerator, but let out the clutch too fast and stalled. Hastily, she tried again, but did the same thing, and the truck stalled once more. Randy tore out of the front door, sprinted across the driveway, and wrenched open the driver's side door. She turned to yell, but instead of words, she gagged and felt whatever it was inside her mouth unroll like a New Year's noisemaker. Eyes wide, Randy arched back to dodge what appeared to be a black, segmented appendage about a foot long and an inch around, ending in a tear-shaped nodule with a barb like a bent fishhook, and fell on his ass. Not a second later, it spooled back into her mouth and she clamped her jaw shut, simultaneously confused and thrilled by her strange new talent. Randy sat in the dirt, blinking, his forehead crinkled in confusion. Then, from somewhere off in the woods, a gunshot. Without another thought, she closed the door, started the ignition, shifted into first, and tire-spitting gravel raced down the driveway. 5 minutes later, she bucked along a weed-choked mud track through the dim woods, tires snapping, branches strewn about from the hurricane, fat maples too gnarled for the chainsaw huddled to either side. Every one of those trees, hell, every stick in that forest belonged to her and her kin, the way it had for nigh on 2 centuries, since her great-great-great-grandpappy claimed it from the wild Abenaki. Steaming like a pressure cooker, she dodged the occasional fallen birch or snapped off beech top at the edge of the former cow path, clearly dragged out of the way by the intruders. The pickup burst out of the forest gloom into the dazzling light of the open pasture. She flew past a parked station wagon and, squinting, could just barely make out 2 figures standing at the far edge of the field next to what looked like stacked hay bales. This land had nourished her body and soul for every one of her 86 years until they had become one and the same. Just as she wouldn't allow some stranger to defile her body, so she wouldn't let them do that to her property. It was an act of violence, plain and simple, and to sit back and let it happen was to invite more of the same. From inside of her mouth, her tongue clicked and clacked against her dentures on its own accord like a hornet in a jar. Gripping the wheel tighter, she punched down on the accelerator and shifted into third, then fourth, headed straight for the invaders. So that was the first chapter of unpublished Alpha Syndrome. So the process of writing this was interesting, and this is how this is all tying into integral stuff. So I used to be an activist working on mostly environmental causes, but some social justice causes. And so the main character, Rufus, is based loosely on my experiences, and not so much, but just the concept of it. So basically in this, he's not an environmentalist, he is a radical feminist activist. And so he believes a lot of the dogma there. You know, a lot of feminism, of course, makes perfect sense. Women should have equal opportunities. Women have many strengths, all of which men have some strengths that are greater, some, you know, some balance, some imbalance. It's pretty straightforward. However, radical feminism is basically, some folks will argue it's kind of a blue or amber concept. It's the right and wrong. So it's basically, some of the tenets are basically like all sex is rape, all women are oppressed, all men are oppressors, that kind of thing. But basically, I have Rufus coming from a green perspective. So he's coming from a world where he's pro-feminist, and he sees a lot of the negative impacts on women from society, but then he also starts to see some other sides of it. He sees women who take very domineering positions, and he sees situations where men are actually struggling. And so he starts to have a little more holistic view of, oh, for sure women are having a hard time here, for sure men have privilege, but then there's the other side of the coin. And so he's struggling with that a little bit. And that was based on some of my involvement with the environmental movement, where I remained a very strong activist, but I could see other perspectives. I could be like, oh, okay, maybe this logger isn't doing the best thing, but he's not some evil person. He's tying into this larger thing. And maybe if we came up with better ways to log in certain areas while preserving other, so getting a little bit more nuanced. And the more I started to also see how ineffective we were being and how we can actually move forward in ways that weren't just about emotion, I actually found myself increasingly alienated from the environmental movement. So I took those concepts over into this radical feminist world, which I have a little bit of familiarity with, but I did a bunch of research on it for that to be all realistic. And basically, he was finding that he was making a shift in himself. And so I started writing this, the first several drafts of this, before I understood concepts of integral. So basically he's shifting over from, let's say, green to yellow or teal. And I myself believe that I was shifting in a similar way, but I didn't know how to explain it at the time. I wasn't quite clear on what was happening. So when I stumbled on spiral dynamics and integral and Ken Wilber and stuff like that, finally I could understand what was going on. And it was a huge, huge relief to just know. I'm like, well, I'm not becoming more conservative. So what the hell is going on? Why are my former allies just starting to be very annoying to me? And why are they not liking me as much? What's happening here? So that was sort of the journey in this particular horror novel for the character. He starts having these shifts and he questions it. And what goes more into the plot is there is this, what he believes to be a tick-borne illness, but we actually find out is this, it's not even a disease, but it's a condition caused by this fire elemental that basically turns everyone into, like I said, these egocentric alphas that red, right? So basically folks are turning red all around him, and in different ways, right? Some will be very physically dominant, some will be, in other ways like lawsuits, or just very protective of their family, things that could become very extreme in a very, very egocentric way and very aggressive way. And then it's actually accompanied by physical changes in terms of whatever animal bit them, which had been from this fire elemental goes into the different animals. I'm trying to remember because it's been a little while since I looked through. So the fire elemental enters an animal, and then the animal bites a human, and then they start transitioning. And Rufus thinks it's a tick, but it's actually that only happened one time. So what I do there, instead of just saying here is this concept of people devolving, I bring the horror element into it, and kind of creatures, and then some sort of red herring, which is the what he thinks is basically a co-infection with Lyme disease. And I have physical changes. So some of them get like a bullfrog throat, or some of them have like, start taking on like spider eyelashes, spider leg eyelashes, just little subtle things, and sometimes not so subtle, as a way to make that concept of regression more palpable and fitting into the genre, because I think that's a very effective way. In fact, that's why I write fiction, is because sometimes it's harder to just put out the concept. If you say, here's this psychological concept, people are like, okay, maybe I'll be into it. But you already have to have interest in it. And I was a journalist, and I still am, and kind of on sabbatical, but you present facts to people, and they're like, maybe only people who are already interested in it. But if you tell people a story with an interesting character, or interesting variety of characters, and a cool plot, and then like a cool hook with like people are turning into these monsters, you can get those concepts across a little better. And so Rufus goes through that, and he tries to figure out what the hell's going on. He has all sorts of hijinks, and then he has a friend who is basically his counterpart. So his friend is basically, where he is a kind of prudish radical feminist, like to the point where there's this woman who is the love interest, and she's a topless rights activist, and that is very unnerving to him. He doesn't know how to deal with it. He's attracted to her, but he's like, it is wrong for me to be attracted to the female form. I should not be objectifying her. But so he has all sorts of issues with that. And then he has his friend who is basically a men's rights activist and a pickup artist. So like the complete opposite, in many ways embodying a lot of red aspects, maybe even blue, because he does have blue or amber. He does have kind of this structured version of right and wrong in the world. But they're obviously very different counterparts, and they have a reason why they overlap. But he starts realizing, well, maybe some of what this guy is saying sometimes is true. It's like, maybe I am being a little bit too much of a prude, and I should be able to express my sexuality. At the same time, whoa, these aspects are going too far. So it's kind of that integral concept of, you can see a positive element in all perspectives. Red, you got to be able to defend yourself and be aggressive if you really need to, and certainly be assertive. Incorporating the amber and blue of right and wrong to a certain degree, the concept of ethics, it's a very valuable thing. So I thought it would be a cool concept. The thing is, no editors or publishers or agents wanted to touch this with a 10-foot pole. And none of them could explain why, is the interesting thing. And I think it was a combination of, well, maybe it just wasn't meant to be published. I've had lots of other stuff published. They didn't want to touch this. I don't necessarily think it was because I utilized integral concepts in it, though I have talked to a couple other horror writers who are in this world, and they said that anytime they submit a piece that has that, the editors want them to take that element out. And that's kind of what I noticed with this. And I'm not pretending that this was a perfect piece, and maybe there were other reasons for them rejecting it. But the one editor who actually gave me specific feedback, and that's a sign that when you don't get actual specific feedback after you've been writing for a while, it's because they don't know why they're saying no. They're just like, I don't know. So maybe it was because the integral concepts were too much for them. I don't know. But I think it was partially because I included political elements for sure. So in pretty hardcore stuff, like, radical feminism, I go pretty in depth with all of that stuff. But what I actually think was the issue is their response to me was saying, well, we don't want a story that tells people what political views to have. And I was like, you so missed the point, like the whole point of my novel. And I was like, well, maybe I didn't get this out very well, but the whole thing is that there is good and there are things that make sense in all perspectives, and then there's usually a measure of bullshit. And so I think he took whatever his viewpoints were and saw maybe, oh, look, he's making the radical feminism look stupid here, and he's making the men's rights guy look good. We can't allow this. Or maybe it was the opposite, and he's making the radical feminist appear too sensible, and he's shitting too much on this more reasonable guy who actually understands how things are in sex and dating, the men's rights activist, the pickup artist. I think he read whatever he wanted into it, because I was incorporating across the board the silliness and the validity of all these viewpoints. So like literally the opposite of what this editor claimed was in my piece. And again, maybe I just didn't do a good job of that, but I think it was just, he assumed it had to be one or the other. Like, you're clearly on a side here. It's like, no, I'm not on any side. And so that would maybe be a caution to anyone who is trying to incorporate these elements into fiction. Make sure, I would say, do it a lot more subtly than I did, and being aware that if you're getting deep into any of these political aspects, people are going to not want to touch it. I mean, this was right around Me Too when I was putting it out there, so I have him kind of womanizing and realizing that it's not a great thing, but it's almost like, to show that something isn't a great thing, you have to go through it and see it for what it is. And I think I did too realistic a version of that. I don't know. All I know is that I gave it a try, and for my next novella, which I just finished writing and I'm putting out there, I made everything a lot more subtle, and I do have elements of, I utilize spiral dynamics pretty much for a lot of my characters, and making sure each one of them is in a different thing. And then, but the funny thing is this, so they rejected it possibly because of the integral aspects, who knows. So everyone knows that in fiction writing, a character has a character arc. The character needs to have changed by the end. That's the whole premise of it. That's basically, for the most part, that's going through the V-memes. That's basically what that is. Now, maybe it's a shift from an unhealthy version of a V-meme into a healthy version, but typically it's not. Typically it's actually a leveling up. So I find an interesting exercise to take a look at books that we might know, and we see, okay, this guy, he's a murderer, and then he goes to prison and he finds Allah or something like that, red to blue or to amber. So it's already happening in fiction. I think if we want to get these concepts out there, we need to be subtle. I am not a subtle person, and I did not write a subtle novel for this, and therefore no one gets to read it. So that's what I get. But it was a great experience to write it, and I learned a lot just about the process and about what you have to get through gatekeepers. And these gatekeepers are typically, these days, it's, like orange and green folks. So orange, they're most concerned about what is the widest audience you're going to reach commercially. So deep concepts, no thank you. And then green is like, do we like all the things that are said in here? You sure humanize that guy who seems like a piece of shit a little too much. And then you're kind of, are you suggesting that some elements of feminism might not be valid? Where even if they secretly believe that, they're not going to put their name on something like that. So I was a little bit more optimistic, or maybe delusional, about thinking that the work would stand for itself. It did not. So that's my spiel. I hope you enjoyed that little blip. No one else will ever see it again. Who knows? You can check out my stuff at joshsworstnightmare.com. Sign up for my newsletter if you like. I'm on social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm also a part of something called Denver Horror Collective, denverhorror.com, and that is a collective of horror authors, and we do all sorts of events, including one on the 25th, which this might be too late for, in which case ignore that, but it's called All Hallows Improv Scary Telling, where we're going to do improv storytelling from prompts live via Zoom, all horror, dark stuff. But yeah, if anyone is a dark fiction or horror author and wants to get in contact with me, Josh at joshsworstnightmare.com. And thank you very much, Bruce, for having me.
The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday, the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. That was the opening paragraph from H.P. Lovecraft's famous Call of Cthulhu. That story is the tale of a pluralistic monstrosity rising from the bottom of the dream sea, sending pandemic ripples of madness into poets, drug addicts, contemplatives, cultists, and borderline psyches of all kinds, rising to return our world to the dominance of archaic hyperobjects. A tale told in multi-perspectival flashbacks, this weird tale begins, very interestingly for us, with the inversion of integrative thinking. The narrator starts out grateful that we cannot integrate the diverse perspectives in our souls and our societies. If we see too much of reality by means of combining internal energies and viewpoints and disciplines of study to get a more complete picture, then we are at risk of inhuman degrees of consciousness, encounters with entities that rupture first-tier reality, and a vision of a universe so vast, complex, transformational, and other-like that our reliable experience of conventional reality will be flipped and released vertiginously into the cosmic perspective. Sounds pretty good, right? He's describing the goal of an integral post-metaphysical spirituality, describing it as something dark and terrible, but nonetheless, describing it. He's seen it somewhere. Hi, I'm Layman Pascal, and I hate rebranding. This endless liberal effort to reframe marketing propaganda, switch things into nicer, more accurate, faddish, and bloodless terminology exploits our universal human fragility in the face of language, such that we treat words, names, and labels as magical entities that determine reality. I hate something about that. I always have. Seems like such a passive, reactive, and negative way to relate to language. Aren't we just surrendering the battlefield before the battle takes place, letting other people and negative forces have the words, deciding we don't like them? Why not deepen and refine the meanings of our words instead of entering into the superficial fray of battle against charged words and improper associative category labels? But as much as I disrespect this endless attempt to make our words more positive and accurate and reflective of contemporary concerns, I nonetheless would not describe the overtly racist and superficially sexless and subtly perspective pulp fiction savant H.P. Lovecraft as a horror writer. That doesn't feel like the right label. This stuff is probably better referred to as cosmic dark fantasy spiked with heavy doses of hyperlinguistic retro-irony. You see, Lovecraft isn't scary. Listen to this sentence from his story, The Shadow over Innsmouth. For a moment my brain reeled, both from sheer hopelessness and from a rapid increase in the omnipresent fishy odor. That is not horror. What is he telling us in this sentence? There was sheer hopelessness. Not just any hopelessness. This was sheer. Its existential activity was turned up a notch, maybe all the way. I mean, this thing had isness all over it. A supersalient maximum of hopelessness. And as if that vivid ultra-hopelessness wasn't bad enough, there was also this fish smell, like being down at the docks, a fleshy marine odor. There was that too, in addition to the overwhelming fact of indefinitely intense pure hopelessness. Those two things. This is what he's saying. It borders on comedy. This is not a slasher flick or a jump scare or a carefully constructed masterpiece of terror and suspense. This is that preposterous moment in the classic Twilight Zone opening when Rod Serling suddenly steps out in a business suit from a closet that he has no business being in and starts lecturing you about an additional dimension of transrational weirdness. This Lovecraft guy enjoys hyperlinguistic surfing on the vagaries of the mind. And I do mean vagaries. Listen to this. What I saw, or fancied I saw, was a disturbing suggestion of undulant motion far to the south. A suggestion which made me conclude that a very large horde must be pouring out of the city along the level Ipswich Road. The distance was great, and I could distinguish nothing in detail, but I did not at all like the look of that moving column. It undulated too much and glistened too brightly in the rays of the now westering moon. There was a suggestion of sound, too, though the wind was blowing the other way, a suggestion of bestial scraping and bellowing, even worse than the muttering of parties I had lately overheard. All sorts of unpleasant conjectures crossed my mind. I was lucky enough to witness the rising of Lovecraft's cultural presence from its own dream temple at the bottom of the ocean of literary history. When I started high school, you could not get his books anywhere, really. It was an ordeal. He was just a name you heard Stephen King mention sometimes. But then the vast, inhuman, multi-tentacled internet seemed to change all that. Almost overnight when I was a kid, you suddenly started seeing Cthulhu run for president. Every decent bookstore began to carry updated collections of these stories. Comic books, TV shows, and oddly enough, legitimate literary criticism began in earnest. Suddenly everyone had heard of the dreaded Necronomicon. That was great for me, partly because I met sexy, smart girls who loved Lovecraft and wanted to combine linguistic play, retro moods, dark imagination, and cosmic scope. These were girls who looked down on vampire and werewolf fan fiction as crude, insufficient, imaginatively bland, and conformist. Like me, they weren't excited unless the story started to stray off the game board into wild descriptions of the vivid indescribability of almost anything. In the most abstract possible form of BDSM, Lovecraft, he constantly makes language and linear thought confess its humiliating subordination to the non-linear and the vaguely felt and the almost spiritual excessiveness of every qualitative experience in perversely intricate faux scientific detail. The full story, so far as deciphered, will shortly appear in an official bulletin of Miskatonic University. Here I shall sketch only the salient highlights in a formless, rambling way. Myth or otherwise, the sculptures told me of the coming of those star-headed things to the nascent, lifeless Earth out of cosmic space. Their coming and the coming of many other alien entities, such as at certain times embark upon spatial. They seem to be able to traverse the interstellar ether on their vast membranous wings, thus oddly confirming some curious hill folklore long ago told to me by an antiquarian colleague. They had lived under the sea a good deal, building fantastic cities and fighting terrific battles with nameless adversaries by means of intricate devices, employing unknown principles of energy. Evidently, their scientific and mechanical knowledge far surpassed man's today. Some of the sculptures suggested that they had passed through a stage of mechanized life on other planets, but had receded upon finding its effects emotionally unsatisfying. Their preternatural toughness of organization and simplicity of natural wants made them peculiarly able to live on a high plane without the more specialized fruits of artificial manufacture, and even without garments except for occasional protection against the elements. It was under the sea, at first for food and later for other purposes, that they initially created Earth life, using available substances according to long-known methods. The more elaborate experiments came after the annihilation of various cosmic enemies. They had done the same thing on other planets, having manufactured not only necessary foods, but certain multicellular protoplasmic masses capable of molding their tissues into all sorts of temporary organs under hypnotic influence and thereby forming ideal slaves to perform the heavy work of the community. These viscous masses were without a doubt what Abdul al-Hasbrid whispered about as the Shoggoths in his frightful Necronomicon. Though even that mad Arab had not hinted that any existed on Earth, except in the dreams of those who had chewed a certain alkaloidal herb. When the star-headed Old Ones on this planet had synthesized their simple foods and bred a good supply of Shoggoths, they allowed other cell groups to develop into other forms of animal and vegetable life for sundry purposes. Just sundry purposes. There's so many vague and impossible signifiers in that semantic web, it's practically a hypnotic induction. Just power-loading unspecified significance. And really, what could be more appropriate for our semantically overamped times? We live in an epoch where we have to say literally just to mean metaphorically. Our athletes have to give 110% in every game, and no one even believes you authentically ate breakfast unless you say you really fucking ate breakfast. Linguistic excess is the normalized form of negotiating authenticity through contemporary words. And the failure of language, the lack of containment of our concepts, the incontinence of meaning is the new language in this Lovecraftian epoch. He had a prophetic instinct for this stuff. He was retro in the 20s, trying to sound like Poe and other guys from the 1880s. He was a contemporary of James Joyce, and like Finnegan's Wake, this stuff starts to make language seem like an oceanic surface of gibberish that hides cyclic mythological mega-patterns whose nonlinear scope dwarfs the inadequate modern notions of language, meaning, and culture. That's where we access the true uncanny valley, like the gap between a man and his own voice. What Freud called unheimlich, which I would translate as unsettling, insofar as your home is a settlement. Yes, unsettling, but not horror. This is not Freddy versus Jason. This is not The Silence of the Lambs. It is, though, Jordan Peele's comedy Supernatural Terror Hybrids. And it is David Lynch's unnecessary super close-up on an electrical socket that for some unknown reason is screaming within human syllables in an unseen dimension that encroaches upon this one and makes cinematic mockery of our suspension of disbelief. As I'm sure Slavoj Žižek would agree. 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 The meta-contextual patterns of Lovecraftian emphasis and uncanny attunements speaks to our world today. The winds from the transmodern meta-crisis were already blowing on Lovecraft's weird, deviant, prejudiced pen at the beginning of the 20th century. Listen to what he says about Walter Gilman, the protagonist of Dreams in the Witch House. Possibly Gilman ought not to have studied so hard. Non-Euclidean calculus and quantum physics are enough to stretch any brain, and when one mixes them with folklore and tries to trace a strange background of multi-dimensional reality behind the ghoulish hints of the Gothic tales and the wild whispers of the chimney corner, one can hardly expect to be wholly free from mental tension. Gilman came from Haverhill, but it was only after he had entered college in Arkham that he began to connect his mathematics with the fantastic legends of elder magic. Something in the air of the hoary town worked obscurely on his imagination. The professors at Miskatonic had urged him to slacken up and voluntarily cut down his course load at several points. Moreover, they had stopped him from consulting the dubious old books on forbidden secrets that were kept under lock and key in a vault at the university library. But all these precautions came late in the day, so that Gilman had already some terrible hints from the dreaded Necronomicon of Abdul al-Hazred, the fragmentary Book of Ayman, and the suppressed Una Spreklichen Kultina von Junts to correlate with his abstract formulae on the properties of space and the linkage of dimensions both known and unknown. Possibly Gilman ought not to have studied so hard. You think? Was it possibly a mistake to combine non-Euclidean calculus, quantum physics, and ghoulish multidimensional folklore? If it was, then many of us today are doomed. It's not just every tweet from Donald Trump that makes the world seem like it's spinning out of control. It's every issue of every physics magazine. It's the disconnect between the implicit logic of capital and the actual economic needs of citizens. It's the fact that professional athletes now recommend psilocybin and burger meat is grown in labs, and the digits of pi go on forever without repeating. Just describing the actual facts of reality in our historical moment counts as intellectual tentacle porn. So the next time you hear that a former integral thinker was seen shambling and mindless at an overly tattooed, overly pierced Bardo Realm nightclub in the seedy underbelly of the city, that his eyes had an oddly broken look, and that maybe you caught a glimpse of gill slits starting to form on his neck, don't be shocked. He's probably just been studying hyperobjects and computational irreducivity in the back loop of the panarchy cycle. Maybe listening to Roger Penrose describe endless cycles of big bangs while he meditates daily on the juiciest yantras, mantras, and tantras that have bled out of the sacred temples over the past century and now literally litter the streets of the Kali Yuga. Maybe Lovecraft is right. Maybe that's too much reality. Think about the year 2020. And tell me if this sounds familiar. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger. A danger widespread and all-embracing. Such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that the people went about with pale and worried faces, and whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demonic alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt the world and perhaps the universe had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown. Niar Lathotep, the crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audient void. Was he a good writer? I don't know. I think his art form wasn't short stories, poems, or novels. I think his art was world creation. And maybe we should all let our imagination go that deep. Create a world, not a book.
In the Celtic tradition, there is what's known as the other world, or in other traditions known as the spirit world. And that world and our world, in one way, are seen to be other world, but in another way are understood to intersect. And in particular, that there can be points of specific permeability or liminality. And certain times or seasons of the year can also be their own kinds of liminal spaces where the veils are particularly thin. And classically, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, the time around All Hallows Eve, All Saints Day, All Souls Day, Samhain, if you're going back prior to Christian language. This was a particular time where the veils were said to be ultra thin. So Bruce invited me to do some uncanny or some weird natural stories. And I thought I'd offer a few that have to do with the dream world, and also particularly All Hallows Eve, All Saints Day, Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, if you're in Mexico, right? All Souls Day. There's a time of year when the veils between this world and the other world, as we said, are thin, and therefore there's a lot of understanding of communication and potentials for honoring as well as receiving communication from those who have gone before us, from our ancestors. So one of the stories is about that form of communication, and the other has to do with how the dream world might be able to teach us and be a place where we do work. So in both cases, I have a personal story that then moves over into something that I learned in my own process, which then assisted me, helped me understand how to be of help to others going through something similar. So I offer these in the light of All Hallows Eve and the veils being thin. If we think of the calendar of a year kind of like a 24-hour cycle, then fall, autumn is the twilight state, when we're moving from the fullness of the sun, obviously in the summer, to the fullness of the darkness in the winter, and we're in the kind of transitional zone. And that's classically associated in the Wheel of Life with the West, as the sun is setting, which obviously connects us to the realms of death and the other world. So around that time in 2016, just a bit after my mom died, she actually died the night of the 2016 US presidential election when Trump was elected president. So that was a bit surreal on a lot of levels. So she died in November 2016. Fast forward at least 6 months, it might have even been 9 or 10 months, but certainly into the year following. I have a dream one night. And in this dream, I'm in an old church hall where a wedding reception is going on. Now, a little bit of backstory. I'm a super introvert, and this would be the last thing in the world that I'd ever actually want to be at. It's not my favorite kind of social setting, but it was one that my mom loved. So I grew up in a big, extended Roman Catholic family. My mom, both of her parents, my grandparents, both came from families of 13. So there was an incredible number of aunts, uncles, cousins, great aunts, great uncles, and we were constantly doing baptisms and weddings and wedding anniversaries and funerals and confirmations and first communions. And so these kinds of settings in the dream were very common in my childhood and adolescence, even though it wasn't my favorite type of situation to be at, but it was one that my mother really longed for and loved. So I'm in the dream, I'm in this setting. It's a wedding reception, it's indoors. It's bringing back all these old memories of like how many of these I've been to throughout my life. And then I have a moment in the dream where I think to myself, what the hell am I doing here? Like, this is not my scene. This is not a place I generally want to kind of hang out in. And then as soon as I had that thought, then the next thought was, I feel like I'm in someone else's dream. That's weird. This doesn't feel like my dream. This feels pretty alien, it was familiar again from my background, but not preferred. and I never really had dreams of this kind. So I literally had this thought, like, am I in someone else's dream? And then as soon as I had that thought, kind of in dreams, like if you intend something or you imagine something or you think it, it's sort of instantaneous. There's no real lag between the thought and the manifestation. So I have this thought, maybe I'm in someone else's dream. And then I think, who this kind of reminds me of, or who would like being in this space, is my mom. And the second I had that thought, then I felt her presence. I couldn't see her at that point, but she was sort of behind and to my right in my visual field or experience in the dream world. And it was instantaneous. I could feel, and I knew instantaneously it was her. So I turn around and look in her direction, and she's doing what she would always be doing in these social settings. She was hugging all the babies, kissing the babies, hugging everybody, checking in with everybody. She's just kind of floating around the space, like she's running for mayor or something. Like she would talk to everybody, just extreme extrovert. She's walking around, connecting to everybody, hugging, greeting, affectionate connections. She sees me, but she's still for a while going around, connecting to everyone else. And then at a certain point, she turns and starts coming towards me. And I'm expecting that she's going to maybe say something to me. But she actually just looks at me for a few moments, right in the eyes, like soul to soul, gives me a big smile, kiss on the cheek, and then kept going to say hi, to hug and connect to others at the party. And as she kind of glided around and went forward, I noticed in the last few years of her life, she'd had a lot of physical pain, a lot of chronic challenges with her health. And she was really liberated and freed of that. Her movements were really easeful and elegant and smooth. And I remember as she had come by, kissed me on the cheek, and kept going, that I remember thinking she just wanted me to know that she was good, that she was happy, that she was in her space. And it was time for me to go. So I woke up. It was early in the morning, and I had total just waterworks, as you might imagine. And I remember realizing in that moment that I didn't dream about her, that she had invited me into her dream space. She had visited me, or I think even maybe more correctly, she had invited me into her dream space. And I was able then to receive her communication for myself, as well as to pass it on to the rest of my family. So that happens to me personally. A few days later in my work, person, and this actually was like 3 or 4 people that this all happened to within kind of a week or 2 span. So I'm kind of amalgamating a number of stories to create like a composite sketch that isn't one specific person's story, but kind of a rough combination. But 3 or 4 people with issues all in this line of communication from deceased loved ones. Again, it was that time of year where the veils were thin. On this time of year again. So in this scenario, a person tells me a story in our work together, and it was a sorrowful story in a lot of ways. It involved a friend of theirs who died very tragically young. And they were like at a party. Saw a friend, said hi, maybe we're hanging out with other people, going around, a bunch of people, but maybe didn't have like a, long exchange, but connected to each other. But afterwards, the individual tragically dies young. And the person who's still alive is holding this guilt that if only they had spent more time at the party together, maybe they would have taken them home, or, they do this whole like how it could have all worked out differently if only I had done something else kind of thing. So they're carrying a bit of guilt that wasn't based in any real genuine, that was false, but nevertheless was weighing on this person. So then proceeds to tell me the story, and the way in which they described it was, I dreamed about my friend. So please note the frame of reference for the first round. They understood it that they had dreamed about their friend. And in the dream, the friend who had died is there and sends a message that they're okay and all's well, and it's time for them to let go of this guilt that they're innocent and they didn't do anything wrong, and it's time to let all that go because it's getting in the way of their life and they're carrying this burden and they don't need to. And tells this really tender and really beautiful story. And it's obviously really deep in this person's heart. They tell me the full story. I say that I'm really, feel very honored that they've shared that with me. And then I'm going to suggest very carefully a potential refinement. Just that I noted that the language had been, them saying, I dreamed about my friend. And I said, well, what if you think about it as your friend visited you in your dreams? And those words weren't even fully out of my mouth yet before the waterworks started for that person, an even deeper layer of resonance and meaning through the experience connected. And that completed and released something, that false guilt that they had been holding, and brought some profound and deep closure to what was obviously a very tragic and sorrowful experience in their past, in their life. And I recognized it from having had my own experience, where first I thought I was dreaming until I realized, was I in someone else's dream? Or as I understood it, was I invited into someone else's dream? Or did they come to visit me? Because in our contemporary world, we have set it up that we say we have a dream. I dreamed about this, or I dreamed about so-and-so, or this situation. And we make ourselves the actor, the subject of the sentence, who's doing the action, dreaming about some kind of object. But in the ancient world, they really understood that when we go to sleep at night, we go to a dream world. It's not necessarily always just an intra-psychological process, though plenty of dreams really are. But there are the occasional ones where it's very possible we've entered a dream world and we're potentially encountering other presences, energies, beings, entities, if you want to say it that way, including those we've loved who have gone on. And it might be that they're visiting us. And it might be that they're the one actually taking the initiative and the lead, and we're the ones who might be in the receptive mode. Maybe something to consider. Second story that I want to tell involves a way in which the dream world itself, I think, can become a kind of a teacher or a dojo or a space of practice and liberation and transformation. So when I was when I was a boy, when I was entering into what in the US we call junior high school, 7th, 8th grade, where I grew up, I went through a really rough, very deep patch of bullying that lasted for a couple of years and was really quite intense and really quite destructive for me. Fortunately, by the time I went to high school, I managed to be in a different school and got space, and the bullying stopped. But I started having recurring nightmares that would maybe happen 5 to 10 times a year. I don't know, a handful of times or more, once every couple of months maybe. And these lasted throughout high school. They lasted into when I was in university, so my later teen years into sort of my early 20s. And it was always the same thing. It was always this force or presence. It was kind of a haunting, ghostly. I never really got like a full detailed image, but it was a kind of force or presence that would always be chasing me. It was a classic kind of nightmare type scenario. It was coming after me. And for the first few years, I suppose, my experience was always that I was just fleeing. And then I would wake up right as this thing was, was about to grab me or whatever and attack me. And I'd wake up, shaken and cold sweats and all that. At some point I realized I got to turn around and fight this thing. I got to turn around and face it down. So I actually set this intention and worked to remind myself that next time I had this dream, I wasn't going to run away. I was going to turn around and I was going to go at this enemy, opposition, presence, force thing, whatever monster that was chasing me. And I'm going to try to come at this thing. Eventually, I was able to do that. I was, in fact, able to turn around and go at it rather than to try to run away from it. And the first couple times I got smoked, right? I had set my intention. Interestingly, I noticed, I had set my intention that I wanted to turn around and face this thing, which I did. And then I got a rough lesson because it kind of, came at me and overwhelmed me and attacked me. And then I would wake up again terrified. And at least I hadn't run away, but I was still not really in any kind of a better situation now. I was feeling more sort of assaulted by this energy. So then I said, okay, not just do I need to turn around and go at this thing, I need to be able to have enough strength to destroy it. I have to take this thing down. And that took some time. Again, these dreams would be periodic. It wasn't like I was having them every week, but I really set my intention, like next time I have this dream, I'm turning around, I'm going at this thing. I'm not just going at it. I'm going at it to destroy it. And it took a few times, but I actually managed to get to a place where I finally had a dream where I overpowered this, whatever it was, haunting energy, attacking kind of force or presence. And I just went to town and just ripped this thing to shreds. And then it was really interesting. This light came in the dream. It was all kind of shredded to pieces. And they all kind of dissolved and disintegrated into the light. And it was like a wind or something, and it just kind of went, it was gone. And I never had that dream again. And I didn't think about that for a good decade plus. It was done, didn't think about it, wasn't really in my awareness. till one night, for some reason, I have this dream where I keep hearing the phrase, take the high ground. And I somehow linked it. I didn't really have that dream again. It wasn't a recurring dream because, again, it was done. It was finished in whatever way because of the destruction and the wind and the light and everything. It felt like it was resolved. But I had some kind of memory of that whole process of me first being chased by it and then trying to stand my ground and then getting overwhelmed and then eventually to fight back till eventually being able to obliterate or annihilate this kind of energy and then feeling the release and the resolve of that. I just had some kind of memory of that arc. And then this strange repetition of this phrase that seemed like it came out of nowhere of take the high ground. And when I woke up from the dream, those words were still kind of bouncing around in my mind, or they were kind of on my lips in a way. Take the high ground, take the high ground. And I had really no idea what in the world is this referring to. So I was just like, okay, that's cool, whatever that is referring to. And I somehow linked it to like, maybe it was about that I had fought this thing down and, you know, had stood my ground and that was a high ground or something. I didn't really know, but it didn't really seem particularly clear. Then I'm reading a book a few days later, and the book is about some shamanic practices and medicine people. And one of the individuals in the story talks about if you're ever feeling this, like, whether it's like a recurring nightmare or some kind of energy that's oppositional and you feel like you got to face some fear, some deep-seated fear, you need to take the high ground. Set it up in your experience so that you're in the high ground. And I went, whoa. And I had, kind of the goosebumps, synchronicity type feeling. I still didn't totally know why or what the purpose of this message was, but it was obviously very powerful to have had a dream and then to read a story that was saying and confirming and validating what a message had come through in the dream. But I still didn't really know, okay, that's really cool, but why am I getting this message? Until, of course, the next week of my work with folks, kind of like, much like the experience with then 3 or 4 people show up who had experiences around communication with loved ones and how to clarify that. That week, I ended up with 3 or 4 people who all had recurring nightmares and wanted to get them resolved. People who didn't know each other, there was no link between them. And again, this is a composite sketch that I'm about to offer. This is not any one person's specific experience. So the story is of a recurring nightmare of a person who's on a beach, walking along a beach, and the ocean is just right there. And when they told the story, I noted with interest at the time, because they mentioned it a couple of times as if in passing, but I noted it and thought, well, that's really odd, interesting, fascinating detail, which was they kept mentioning that there was a cliff behind them. They weren't looking at the cliff. They knew it was there. They could sense it, even though they couldn't see it. Kind of like I could sense my mother's presence, even though I couldn't yet see her in the dream space. So there's this cliff behind them. And they're walking along the beach and everything seems nice and sunny and lovely, walking along the beach by the ocean, until out of nowhere, a kind of tremor, earthquake really starts hitting, ground's shaking, turmoil, chaos. And then a giant tsunami kind of wave rises from the ocean and is coming straight at them. And just as it's about to crash down on their heads, they wake up terrified and screaming, obviously. So they're like, can you help me with this? Can we do anything about this? What can we do? And as soon as they asked that question, and for some reason the cliff is really what's sitting with me, not the tsunami, not the beach, not any of that, but the cliff, even though that's not technically part of the formal frontal part of the dream. And I'm thinking about the cliff, and then all of a sudden, finally, the light bulb goes off, and it was like, take the high ground. And I said, well, this is going to sound a bit wacky. I'm just going to be honest. This is going to be a little far out. Maybe it sounds, but I hope you're willing to go with me and see where this goes. That was a bit of a, I don't want to call it an experiment, but a process. I said, what if we allowed you while you were awake, not to go in some deep regression or have to wait till the next time the dream happens when you're asleep. And it might be really hard to be able to remember what to do at that point. What if you just go into a gentle visualization experience? And I'd invite you to walk up to the top of the cliff. And when you're up on the cliff, the wave is going to come. It's going to crash into the shore. There's going to be a big spray. You might get a bit wet, but you'll be totally safe. You'll be totally fine. The wave is not going to flood you. It's going to crash under the cliff. Like we said, maybe a bit of some water will shoot up. That'll be it. And that'll be the end of it. After a little bit of thinking, hemming and hawing, and some reticence, they said they're willing to give that a shot. So again, wasn't in a deep regression state, allowed them to be in control of their own process. And at any point they wanted to get out of it, they just open their eyes, and so they go up to the top of the cliff. I'm just talking with them for a while. Are you feeling calm up there? You feeling steady? Yeah. So then I say, okay, tell this wave, tell this tsunami, whatever, this giant tidal wave, tell this thing to come. Again, took a little bit of trust, a moment or two to be ready to do that. And then they said, come on, wave. And sure enough, in their visualization, here comes the wave, crashes into shore, spray, they get wet, and then it was over. Sun was out, sun was shining, blue skies, birds were chirping. And then in physical form, in this world, they started having spontaneous tremoring and gentle tremoring and kind of a trauma release. What that memory is referring to, why it was so charged in their experience, who knows? Was it, some people go like, oh, it was past life. Other people say, oh, it's an ancestral memory. It's a Jungian collective memory of the human experience. It's a symbolic depiction of an internal state. In my experience, I was saying that it was kind of the exterior manifestation in my dream world of the bullying energy that tortured me and chased me for so many years. Who knows? I don't know. But I do know that they never had that dream again. Ever. And in some other examples where people had similar type scenarios, whether they called them recurring past life memories or strange and often graphic or horrifying or very weird and disturbing imagery that might arise during meditations, during dreams, in visualization type experiences, in the hypnagogic state and the twilight state, just before not totally asleep, but not totally awake in that twilight state. And they would have this strange set of imagery recur in their life. And we found that we could work with them in waking state and resolve them by giving them choice. The two key elements in that story, I thought, was to take the high ground. They got to choose to walk up the cliff, whereas in every previous story, they felt frozen and helpless and having no choice. The wave is just going to come and drown them and overwhelm them. So they got to set the high ground. And then also they got to tell the wave when to come to them, not them being at the mercy of the wave, just seemingly hitting upon them without their choice. And so those stories all took place in various years of my life and my work with people all around this time of the year, when the veils are thinner and our connection between this world and the other world seem to be more open or transparent. So I hope that's, even though there's tenderness and some brutality and spookiness and uncanniness and even a bit of horror, as well as tragedy in a number of those stories, I hope you hear that those stories came to places of resolution. That's my hope and my intention in sharing them. Happy Halloween, everyone.
And happy Halloween from all of us at the Integral Stage. I am the last. I will tell the audient boy.